Hey, y'all. On PlainSpoken, I'm kind of all over the place. I'm sure you've noticed if you've watched much of my stuff. Some of it is social commentary. I mostly focus on Methodist type stuff. I've done some broader stuff, and to be honest with you, that's the direction I kind of want to go this year after the general conferences that I'm concerned about. I do think there need to be reasonable voices in the mix talking about the larger cultural things that influence not just America, but the global milieu. We're all connected right now. And today I wanted to talk with Jamie Bambrick. And if you don't know his name, you probably should. He's got a YouTube channel 3 times bigger than mine. He's all over the place. He's much more professional than I am. He does great quality content. And the thing that most of you have probably seen, even if you don't know who created it, was the Super Bowl ad, the Christian Super Bowl ad they should have made. So this comes out of this last year's Super Bowl. Or I don't know, was it this year? Yeah, no, it was this year. There was a He Gets Us commercial that came close to hitting the mark, but it just left a lot of people uncomfortable. And I'm not going to direct you towards that, but I will play a short version of the one that he created because it's fantastic. We can live. And so the reason why I like this one is that it took the same exact aesthetics, had the exact same music, and it made it exactly as it should have been. And he was rightly rewarded with just on YouTube with 500,000 views. I saw it on Twitter. That's where it got really big. And then it turns out he's got a whole channel where he's been producing very high quality content for not even as long as I have, and yet he has a much larger base than I do. Very good thinker. I've enjoyed his content a lot. I'm hoping that a lot of you who watch this today after watching him and praying for him might subscribe to him because I think he's a good cultural influence on us. And I say that it's a big deal because he's not even an American. He's an Irishman. And so at this point, I want to bring the first Irishman I've ever interviewed on screen. This is Jamie Bambrick, everybody. Jamie, thanks so much for joining me. How are you doing, brother?
How are we doing? I am doing very well. Thank you very much, and much appreciate all your kind words. Many of them were probably too kind, but very kind of you to have me on. And yes, I am indeed, if they can't tell by the accent, definitely Irish. Yep, that's me.
Yeah, you're joining me from Northern Ireland, you said. What particular town are you in?
So there basically is one, and that's Belfast, and that's where I am. So we have one city of note. And then we have a few others that are not particularly large or well known. Now, I'm actually a pastor in a town just outside of Belfast, about 30 minutes away. An associate pastor at a church in a town called Craigavon. But people will know of Belfast, and that is where I'm from and where I live. So we'll go with that.
Yeah, we've heard of Belfast, and I'm never going to say that word right. There's an accent on that I never get quite right. But I know, is it the Troubles that is associated with, is that what it's called?
Right. Yeah,
okay, so that's what most
right,
Americans know about, and it's the Irish Catholic versus Protestant split and the long-term resentment that's been there. And then my understanding is that things are not perfect there now, but they're not as bad as they were.
Yeah, that's a reasonably good summary. Yeah, it goes back hundreds of years. There was a bad period from the 1960s through to the late 1990s where there was a fair degree of terrorism and violence. But yeah, that's obviously calmed down, and I think underlying that, this is the thing that I don't think most people know is actually the people of Northern Ireland are extremely warm and friendly, and I love living here. Like, I've lived in other places, and you couldn't make me live there again. I'm obviously from here, so I am slightly biased, but it is, according to even a lot of the people that come from elsewhere that live here, just a really nice neighbourly place in spite of our bad track record. So, that's right. You're right when you say about the Troubles.
Well, I want to learn more about Ireland here in a little bit because there have been some kind of recent developments there that I've seen just on the internet. But I want to start with the place where I started, which was this video that you produced. It's just a minute long, and it was done. If there was a single thing about it that could be changed and made better, I'm not smart enough to find it. I thought it just so perfectly hit the sweet spot at that moment. And you've already talked about how you got the idea, how it all came together, and all that. Is there a place where you've talked about that for people who are curious, just to watch and hear that story? Because I know you've probably told it 100 times. You don't want to do that now. Where have you laid that
Yeah,
out?
I mean, yeah, probably the most notable one would have been Charlie Kirk. So I was on with Charlie Kirk talking about it. So if you go on to, if you type in my name and TPUSA Faith, I talk about it there at reasonable length. And then there's a slightly more longer version with a guy called, a couple of guys, one Foolproof Theology and another one, Owen Strahan, although we would call him Owen Strachan over here. That they give a slightly longer version. So yeah, of course, if people are interested in that, they can check that out.
Great. I didn't even know you'd done anything with Owen or with Charlie, and I know who those guys are. Not real well, obviously, but
Sure.
anyway, that's great. I'll look forward to watching that stuff later. As soon as I saw it, I was like, "How do you do this and not get sued?" So, is that a question they asked you? Like, has anyone threatened you with a lawsuit?
No one's threatened me with a lawsuit. No, I mean, it's not defamatory. These are public stories. And I didn't monetize the video, so there's no, illicit gain. I didn't make a penny, even though it went so big, didn't make a penny from it. I had no intention of doing so. So it would almost fit under, I think it would potentially fit under parody, you could say in that way, that I intentionally made it as a non-comedic version of the same thing. So it would fit within fair use. There was no copyright claim against the music or anything like that. And because those stories of the individuals involved were well known, and I wasn't speaking against He Gets Us, I didn't say anything about them that, was untrue. It was just here's a different version. So
Yeah, I guess I didn't take into account that it wasn't monetized, so that matters. And then the music, I tried to find that song. I just thought it was instantly so beautiful, and I couldn't find it on Apple Music or Amazon. So I didn't know if you just ripped it from the commercial directly and then used it again or anything.
Yeah, let's not admit that in public, but yes, no, I did.
Well,
I'm assuming that's okay.
This is something, I'm kind of trying to do a similar thing to you. I'm very concerned about the direction Western culture and society is going, and I think it does take. I don't think we can defer to just one voice or one set of voices or one media outlet. I think there has to be a cacophony of voices saying, hey, this really is not going well. We need to turn back in some important ways. And to do that well, you have to find connection points with developments in society and then insightfully, creatively, wisely kind of focus on what's wrong about that. And then also to propose what's right. It's real easy to tear down. It's not easy to build up. And so to even do that, you had to have a knowledge, not just of what's wrong, but of what's right. You had to know of all these stories of different people whose lives had been turned around. And it was just the perfect meeting place of a lot of different disciplines that were needed. And, editing video, it turns out being super important for putting out information. And the impression I have is that you edit all your own stuff. Do you?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, absolutely. And I have no background in editing. I had the idea for this channel, or my channel, a few years before I started it. Actually, I was keen to do it. There was a couple of reasons why I didn't start straight away. One of them was just budget, having the ability to get the necessary equipment that would work well to do it. And another one was I wanted to be working in a church context, because that's my background. I wasn't, as perhaps we'll get into later, I did step out of a church context for a couple of years, and I didn't want to just live on the internet. I'm not wired that way. I don't want to just sit in front of a computer, but obviously this requires that, but I didn't want that to be my whole thing. And then, so in that time, I sort of self-taught myself to edit. Whenever I finally got the laptop, spent about, a few months working on various skills, editing being one of them.
To be driven in that way, not a lot of people have that ability to just start something new from scratch and build on top of it. We're trying to train a young man in my church to do some video editing. So I don't enjoy it. I mean, you can tell that to watch my stuff. I do the bare minimum, and it sounds okay, it looks okay. That's good enough for me. You really do take more pride in your craft, and what you present is much more enjoyable, I think, just aesthetically than my stuff. There are not a lot of pastors that are willing to do this. When COVID came, there were a lot of pastors. It was in everything that I read. We've got to go online. You've got to make stuff available online. And even after COVID, after over a year of just absolute paranoia and thinking of people at home, most churches still have terrible live stream options. Most pastors still have very terrible online presences. It's one of those things where everybody knew it probably needed to happen, but very few people actually did make it happen, much less built a platform like yours. So I think that says something about who you probably are. Let's get clear on some basics about who you are. Your name's Jamie Bambrick. Are you ordained through any kind of denominational credentialing entity?
No, I'm not. So I went to an unaccredited Bible college that would have been in the sort of Pentecostal charismatic, which is my upbringing. Again, we might talk more about that. So I went there for a couple of years. I've done a ton of reading, and I am an associate pastor within the Church of Ireland, which is part of the Anglican Communion. So actually quite close ties to Methodism then, obviously, with the Methodist movement having come out of the Anglican movement. The Church of Ireland is slightly distinct. Well, it is distinct from the Church of England. We would be more conservative, particularly in the north. So more Bible believing, and haven't caved on the issues in the way that they have, at least officially, even though there's many faithful pastors in there. So unordained, but which means I can do pretty much everything except for communion and baptism. Those are the things that I can't do. So I do a lot of the other ministry around the church.
Well, tell me about what ministry you do spend your time doing.
Yeah. So I'm an associate pastor, so it's a little bit of a catch-all. We're not a massive church. We don't have a massive staff team. We have really sort of 3 staff members and then a fourth who is part-time for worship and a part-time administrator, and 3, including myself. So I look at newcomers, I look at pastoral care, sort of, depending on the context, but quite a lot of that ends up coming into my world. Preach once a month, and various other organizational things, small groups, things like that. So yeah, it's kind of one of those sort of miscellaneous church roles that associate pastors end up doing in a lot of different contexts.
Yeah, that makes sense. You know that Methodists once upon a time were really big on small groups. Is this something you're familiar with?
Yeah, I am. Yeah. I know the story of Methodism reasonably well. So they basically founded that whole idea, with their questions, wasn't it? They had their what sins have you committed and what things that might have been sin and all of that.
Yeah, John Wesley, the OG Methodist, he had 21 questions that he wanted them to run through. The primary question that he thought should be asked and answered by every person in each session was, how is it with your soul? The kind of weekly report on what God is doing in their lives and kind of reflecting on God's activity. It's the practice has fallen into disrepair. I'm one of several voices saying, hey, we need to reclaim this as an essential mark of Methodism. So it's often kind of a shameful thing for Methodists that many Methodist churches don't insist on it, whereas many other churches do facilitate it strongly, if not insist on it. So that's a good part of ministry to be involved in. When thinking about, before we get into the Irish context, are you married?
Yes, I am. Yeah, married for just coming up on 13 years and 2 boys, age 5 and 18 months.
Oh, that's fun. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so married, 2 kids, pastor, Northern Ireland, online presence, super smart. Okay, let's get into, the thing I was wondering about Ireland. There's a UFC fighter, last name McGregor. I want to say Conor McGregor.
Yep,
He's
Conor
been
McGregor.
Posting on Twitter. Apparently, immigration has been an issue there. It's causing some cultural anxiety. You talk about Ireland being a warm place in its disposition. This is something that's tested by immigration. America, of course, also going through our immigration woes. We have had hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people cross our southern border, not just from Mexico, but from all around the world. A lot of anxiety about what this causes in America. And the way it's been coded in America is, if you have any problem with this, you're a racist. And that's not exactly a satisfying way to go about things. What are the similarities and differences between what America's going through and what Ireland's going through?
Yeah, so just for the sake of clarity, so Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, and so whilst we're on the island of Ireland, we're part of the UK, so our foreign policy is dictated by them as opposed to the Republic. Nonetheless, we obviously have very close ties with the Republic of Ireland, and with that being a story down there, actually, and in the UK as well. It was something that I've addressed in a couple of videos, actually, I've looked at. There is a massive immigration crisis here, both in Ireland and in the UK, where we're at the point now where about 1 in every 6 people in Britain is not born in Britain. So that's a huge influx of people. A lot of that, I mean, so obviously, right, you want to be careful. There's a lot of very good people who have come in for legitimate reasons or for work or whatever, and that's fine. We also have a large percent of Islamic immigration, which is getting to the point where I think it's slightly concerning. So the First Minister of Scotland is a Muslim, the Mayor of London is a Muslim. And so you have real Islamic enclaves throughout the UK, although much less so in Northern Ireland. Most people, because of Northern Ireland's reputation, don't end up landing here, although increasingly so. So we're being influenced by that. The Republic of Ireland has similarly had a massive influx of immigration. So there was in the last, now I don't know what point in the year they do these dates from, but the last full year of immigration that they counted the stats for, it was something like one in every 36 people in the Republic of Ireland had moved there in the last 12 months. Which, if you translate that into an American context, is probably about 9 million people in a 12-month period coming across the border. So that has caused enormous issues for what is a small population. You know, Ireland is quite a rural population still, and very small. So you have lots of towns in Ireland that are perhaps quite like the context where you're in. You said before of maybe 3,000 people, lots of towns like that. If you put 100 people into that who don't assimilate and are involved in crime and so on, that destroys that town. So that's happening across Ireland. It's driving up housing costs to ridiculous levels because you have this demand, you don't have the supply of housing then. And it's really destructive to the Irish culture, which is and has been a very deep and rich historical culture that people here value very, very highly. And really without their consent, this has happened because the governing bodies have said so. And so that's been a big issue. And I do think it is one that the church should speak on. And the church does need to say something more than, if you disagree, you're racist. And so I think addressing it carefully is a good thing to do.
Right. And you, for viewers who haven't watched his stuff, he has an excellent segment he did. You only published it a month ago, the mind-blowing story of how Irish monks saved civilization. So as you're talking about the distinct cultural legacy of Ireland, that's a wonderful piece to watch. And you also I'm not seeing it right in front of me, but you've published a piece on how it is that immigration, what is the mass immigration, the biblical case against mass immigration. That was published 5 months ago. And I haven't watched that one yet, but it's only recently that I've encountered any non-globalist voices who make the case for why it is that immigration might be an issue and that even biblically might be worth reapproaching. And so I'm looking forward to watching that later. But for those who are watching this now, after a couple minutes with Jamie talking about it, you know kind of how to pray for them, but also how maybe to, if you haven't thought much about it, culture is not something that just magically happens when you live on a piece of land. You just magically participate in the culture. It's something that comes about consensually by people sharing in the same fabric. And when that's not happening right now across the West, what are the long-term impacts of that? That's something worth praying about and thinking about. The reason I wanted to talk to you in particular was it seems to me that you do have a mind for understanding this big picture that we're all a part of right now. And of course, there are going to be differences between Northern Ireland and Oklahoma, where we're at. But there are some very large ideas that have, not only do they impact the Anglosphere, I guess, but I'm talking to friends now in Africa who are impacted by these ideas being imported over there. And of course, the picture is much bigger than my brain can fully comprehend, or that an hour of time with you could get into sufficiently. But I wanted to come back to the Jesus gets us thing just briefly, and if you could articulate what it was that you were providing a counter proposal to, what the idea or set of ideas was pertaining to the He Gets Us campaign that is such a threat that we really need to articulate that and push back against it. And hopefully,
Yeah.
hopefully I've not spent so many words on that it's confusing. But yeah, talk a bit about that, please.
Sure. So the He Gets Us ad, for those that maybe don't recall it or haven't seen it, so the original one talks about it. It shows images of people that, generally speaking, would be in our world considered to be in the oppressed category, which actually gives them moral virtue, which is perhaps one of the great ironies of our whole system. But you have some of the things within that are perhaps totally legitimate things that are fine, and then you have other ones that you go, no, that's a sin, right? So you have within that there's someone, and all of the images involve someone washing feet. And so one of them, it's someone washing the foot of a woman outside of an abortion clinic. It seems from context that you're supposed to imply that this woman has either just been in or is going into this clinic. The final image is that of either a gay man or a transsexual, or whatever the correct term is, transgender, having his feet washed by someone who's a member of the clergy. They've got a dog collar on. And so the original premise of that advert, at the end it says, Jesus doesn't preach hate, he washes feet. And the implication, the underlying worldview, the message that I think everybody watching that would have received would have been, anybody that disagrees with woke ideology or with the sins and the proclivities of our day is preaching hate. And actually Jesus doesn't disagree with those things. Jesus actually approves them, and if he was there, all he would say would be, I love you, and wash their feet, which is not the message of the gospel. So the gospel is a call to all of us, whether they're those of us that have grown up perhaps in a Christian context and live with a very Christian morality, or those who embrace all of the ideals of our day, all of the ideologies, all of the proclivities that our day says are good things. We are all called to turn from sin and follow Jesus. And the Bible also gets to define what that sin is. And so my response was then to go through people who had turned from their sin. And in particular, of course, I put in some ones there that would not be viewed as sins by people in our day. So you had a former lesbian activist, someone who's formerly transgender, and so on. Because I think that those are often the most important sins to address. If you look, this is my biblical thinking on it anyway, is if you read through the sermons in the book of Acts, all of them, barring Peter's sermon to the Gentiles, who were quasi-believers in some sense, they were faithful Jewish practitioners that in some way they'd been giving alms and so on and offering prayers. But all of the other sermons address a sin that those listening were likely to have committed. It was a common sin amongst the hearers, and there's a call to repent from those things entailed in each of those sermons. And so I very much think that that's important in our day, to think, well, what are the sins that the average person watching the average person in our day is likely to be committing, and then call them to turn and repent from those sins. There's no point calling people to repent from slavery in our day in the Western context, because we don't have any slave owners, right? But we do have plenty of people committing other sins, and they're very popular sins. And so I think it's important to actually put that angle into our preaching or our communication with the world in any way that we can, where it's appropriate to do so anyway.
Yeah, the concern I see a lot of people having, especially, so I'm connected to a new denomination called the Global Methodist Church. Came out of the United Methodist Church whenever they started. I don't need to recapitulate the whole story, but the thing is that we've left radical leftism, and the question is how much to a previous position we're going to return to. So there have been people saying, hey, we're going to take away the right of women to even preach. We're going to get rid of female clergy. We're going to get rid of maybe divorce. We in the 1960s got away from divorce being a sin. We might become legalists on a whole slew of issues. So the GMC is wanting to maintain some kind of, Global Methodist Church is wanting to maintain some kind of like middle ground where we've liberalized some stuff, but not Not so much that we're with the crazies over here, but we're also not with the fundamentalists over here. And it remains to be seen where we're discerning where all those things are going to be. But as you're talking about these different issues that are being normalized, that biblically are sinful, there are already some that have been normalized for some time, specifically divorce. But also, what I preached about from the pulpit yesterday was cohabitation. It's quite normal. It's my understanding in the UK it's the same. It's quite normal for people to pair off and bond sexually intimately before being married, and even cohabitate for a prolonged period before being married. It's hard to figure out where this dividing line is, where we need to revert to some kind of medieval sensibility versus is there a more modern sensibility where we're not quite as concerned about all the sins that the Bible easily points to. So would I be right in inferring from you that even though it doesn't really hit on it in that tiny commercial where you did hit on several, that divorce and cohabitation before marriage would similarly be seen as biblically unacceptable despite whatever society has done over the last 50 years?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Divorce, you have some cases where it can be acceptable if there's adultery or something like that. But other than that, there's potential extenuating circumstances there, and you can have a debate over how far those go. But certainly, no fault divorce or divorce without some due breach of covenant by the other party is biblically a sin. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's hard for us to know how to hold this because it's real easy to be loud and proud about the issues that society is currently pushing really hard. It's another thing to say, hey, we need to go back 50 years to what was won in the culture war of that day and revisit some of those issues back then. At that point, a lot of people get very leery. And so I'm not really familiar with many voices that are doing that well. I think you probably have a better view of the landscape than I do. Are you familiar with anyone who's doing that well?
In terms of going as far back as divorce, or just generally pushing back on the cultural stuff?
The general pushback, we've got a lot of great people right now, but going back in time and revisiting some decisions that were collectively made that really shouldn't have been. I'm not familiar with many voices doing that well.
Yeah, I mean, there are guys out there. I think there is a growing movement now. In my experience, so I am, as I said, Church of Ireland. Now, my background's in the charismatic movement, and I'm a continuationist, and that actually has links to Methodism as well. Don't know where your audience would be. Don't want to speak for you, but that's where I sit. So I'd be a charismatic evangelical is really my sort of the easiest description of where I'm at. But what I've found is that it's a lot of reformed cessationist guys are some of the really good voices on this stuff, actually. So I've ended up getting to know a lot of those guys, liking a lot of those guys. Soteriologically, I imagine I'm more reformed than you would be. I'm probably not quite as reformed as they would be. But I have plenty of warmth for that disagreement amongst brothers, right? So there are guys out there, the likes of Douglas Wilson, what they've done at Canon Press up in Moscow, Idaho, has been very good. There's then guys that have come in behind that and built their own platforms. And then actually some of the charismatics have done reasonably well on some of these issues. So Dr. Michael Brown is a well-known figure who has the Line of Fire radio podcast. He would be good. So there are voices out there, and interestingly, I think they're actually ones that the average they tend to do well. I think people that speak on these issues, there's a hunger, particularly amongst the congregations. I've found, and I don't know, you may well have found it similar in your context, that I think the pew is more hungry for this than the pulpit is. I think people in ministry are quite scared about saying anything, getting it wrong. We can't address it until we've read every book on the topic and done a big research paper, and we've thoughtfully, and it's like, well, no, there's some basics here that we can definitely talk about and really need talked about and spoken about relatively promptly for the sake of the sheep. If you haven't addressed these issues in 15 years as a church, the society has completely changed its stance on all of this stuff in that time period. And you should have said something a long time ago. So I think the hesitancy on behalf of some of those in ministry is something that does really frustrate me, and it's something I hit in my channel and my videos quite a lot. Is, just man up a little bit, say something. It's not that hard. A lot of this is not that theologically complex. We're not trying to talk about the inner workings of the Trinity. It's fairly basic. It's just unpopular.
The point is well taken, and there are indeed plenty of people who lean into it, even some probably too much, in saying inflammatory things and garnering an audience based on that. But what you're talking about is not that. It's just talking about an unapologetic standing by biblical, not just principles, but explicit language about biblical living and how it is. As a pastor, I've felt myself increasingly resentful of the anxiety of, okay, there's a new young couple attending worship and they're not married and they're living together, and this anxiety about coming to them and saying, hey, this is really not okay, we need to remedy this. Just all of the cultural tension that's already built up, that is already there before I even open my mouth. Or to use another cultural topic, in America, I get the understanding that the topic of abortion, this is something else I saw recently. I think I've seen that, traditionally the Irish have been very against abortion. It's just been but am I right in understanding that that's changed lately?
Yeah, so the Republic of Ireland didn't have abortion until, I can't remember exactly what year it was, I think it was 2016. No abortion, and they didn't have gay marriage. Actually, divorce was illegal in the Republic of Ireland until the late 90s. So, it was extremely influenced by Catholicism, and there were some, speaking as a non-Catholic, there were still some good societal benefits of that, those being among them. They shifted. Northern Ireland, this was considered a devolved matter by the United Kingdom government, so England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland had different policies. We also didn't have abortion or gay marriage and never voted for it. There was basically a legal fiction invented in 2019 that allowed the British Parliament to force it on us as a province. So, because we would have here, one of the benefits of having a big fight over your religion is you care about your religion still. So, we would have a strong religious context here, where people would broadly disagree with those things at a cultural level. Now, I don't know I think if it went to a vote, it would probably be tight, but there'd be a lot more pushback against it than there would be in anywhere else in Western Europe, without a doubt.
Well, that's coming back to what I was saying. I didn't preach about abortion much for a while. One, because I assumed all Bible-believing people know where to stand on that anyway, but two, not wanting to offend others. And then this anxiety about offending people just had such a deleterious impact on me that a couple of years ago I just stopped. And part of that coincided with me leaving the United Methodist Church as well. But there have been, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know how you look at it, people who've left because they're just not willing to follow Jesus if it means that they can't bring their political loyalties in tow. But there's also been a wonderful freedom, and there's been spiritual reward in saying flatly, this is an untenable position. No Christian believers should ever be in favor of this. We should mourn the world that is so wounded in their consciences that they're okay with this. So I appreciate. It just seems to me like there are more people like you. I've watched some of your stuff where you're really, the word I've used before is unapologetic. It's just matter of fact, and it's not a I'm going to say the truth no matter who gets offended. It's more, I love you too much to keep lying to you. And if you haven't heard this before, you need to hear this. And so the case needs to be made, and you do a fantastic job on these. A lot of these are just 10 to 14 minutes long where you make a case winsomely. You're much better about using little funny clips and stuff to just kind of keep the mood light until you need to deal with something of substance. You've also, I just wanted to compliment you. You've done a really good job selecting your guests. You got Craig Keener on, who is associated with Asbury University, which is a Methodist university. You've got Nancy Piercy, who I follow on Twitter, and I just think she's amazing. And so you've got the Remnant Radio guys, who are Oklahomans. I don't know if you knew that.
Yes, I did.
And so, yeah, you've done a good job getting a wide range of very faithful. I should ask you, since you're both not American and you're a part of the UK, do you have any relations with Calvin Robinson at all?
No, I don't. Other than that, after the Super Bowl advert went viral, he messaged me on Twitter privately and said, "Great job," that kind of thing. So he
Yeah.
maybe has some vague awareness of who I am. I would love to build more of a connection with him. I think there's a need for something in the UK of some of those voices to get together and do something. So I don't know. It's something I'm certainly thinking about how do we build something over here that can unify some of those voices and create a bit of pushback. Yeah.
Yeah, he's obviously of the Anglican persuasion, so I don't know how much he would be with. Well, the Anglican Church doesn't have a stance with respect to the cessationist, continuationist debate, do they?
No, I mean I'm Anglican, so we're an Anglican church. We're part of the Church of Ireland, which is Anglican, right? So it's on the global Anglican Communion. So and our bishop would be a continuationist as well. He started a thing called New Wine Ireland, which is sort of a charismatic movement within largely the Anglican churches, although it also have some Presbyterians and so on as well.
So you Anglicans are achieving what the global Methodists are wanting to achieve, which is a good balance between solid doctrine, good order and liturgy, and the gifts of the Spirit and charismatic gifting. Is there I guess as you're doing that, do you notice that there's just a huge umbrella and there's people like stochastic placement all over that? Or is there kind of a monoculture in that is quite common?
No, Anglicanism is a label that's too broad, in my opinion. If someone says they're Anglican, they could mean literally anything from a wild-eyed progressive liberal to a very reformed cessationist to a sort of bouncy, charismatic, happy clappy. And anything in between. So I don't really know how that label is helpful. I think it tends to be more defined then by the sub-networks that people are in. So New Wine would be one that exists in England, for instance, at a much greater scale than it does here, obviously just in more numbers. And that would be your sort of charismatic side. You would have some well-known conservative, evangelical, reformed charismatic, or not charismatic, sorry, Church of England groups and so on within that as well. So yeah, I don't know that holds together well. There's probably been some benefit of, in England, I know because my brother-in-law is a faithful Church of England minister, so he's not compromised. And there's been a lot of cooperation between the likes of the New Wine charismatics and the more reformed types on pushing back on what the bishops are doing regarding same-sex marriage blessings, they're calling it over there. So yeah, there's enough commonality there for those guys, but unfortunately the label is probably too broad in my opinion.
Yeah, that's what the United Methodist Church went through, where you could be a United Methodist and believe just about anything. It's really quite amazing that the Anglicans have held together better than we have, although in America, it's worth pointing out, the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Church in North America have no fellowship with each other, but it's my understanding that they both consider themselves in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury in some regards. So the complexities of that are lost on me. Do you understand them better than I do?
No, I don't. So I didn't even really grow up Anglican. I've been in an Anglican church for a couple of years, so I'm not super au fait with it. The one big thing that I do know is that there's something called GAFCON, which is the global something or other. G's for global. I don't know what AFCON stands for.
It's the faithful ones, right?
Yeah, they're the good ones. Anyway, they've
Yeah.
said that they're not in fellowship with I believe the Archbishop of Canterbury, so they've gone that far, and
Oh, wow.
and I think that. And I know some churches that have done that as well. There's a well-known, again, this would be one of your more reformed but very good guys out there, St Helens Bishopsgate, which would be a large Anglican church in London that most people in the Church of England would know of. They've said the same thing, so that's started to happen a little bit. So yeah, I think there is probably a degree of splintering that is very likely to happen, particularly over this issue. And I know all of the Bible-believing Anglicans are talking about what their plan is, basically, whenever the bishops push all of this through against the will of both the ministers of churches that are growing and the congregants, which, all of these bishops are in small and dying churches, and that doesn't mean that that's the sole cause thereof, but it just tends to be that the life consists in the more Bible-believing section of the Church of England.
A lot of overlaps here between your tribe and mine. We have about 15 minutes left, and the areas that I'm sensing you would have the most treasures to offer in are talking about charismatic Christianity and about the megachurch movement. You grew up in charismatic Christianity. You've done ministry in a charismatic or in a evangelical megachurch. And as I said earlier in this conversation, we're swimming in a lot of the same cultural waters. There are global ideologies that are traveling as far as humans live, and so there are things that you've seen from the inside that are worthy of consideration, especially for my audience that's mostly Methodist and trying to build a vision of Methodism that is more biblical. So I guess let's start with the charismatic Christianity. What most people, I think, hear when they hear someone say, I'm a charismatic, is I believe in speaking in tongues, often in worship, and I believe in miraculous healings and sometimes prophecies, speaking a supernatural word. These are the sort of things that are culturally normative in charismatic Christianity to a layman like me. And so how much does that fit what you mean when you say that you grew up in a charismatic tradition, that you're a charismatic Anglican?
Yeah, so that's obviously varied. So I've been in a number of different church contexts, from sort of free church evangelicalism through to sort of a number of other different ones, all of them with that charismatic leaning, and it would have played out a little bit differently given on the context. I would say that what we do is so we would not speak in tongues, corporately during a church service, for instance. Someone may privately, quietly on their own, do that or something, and we're not going to go and shout at them. But that's not something that we say, let's all pray in tongues together, everybody. I think that 1 Corinthians 14 probably says that, and there are some different readings on it. I've heard people try and give it offense of doing so. I think you're stretching it pretty far, because that seems to be exactly what it's saying not to do in 1 Corinthians 14, to anybody reading it, in a plain manner. But I would believe that the what might be termed, now I don't agree with the term, but the sign gifts, so the 1 Corinthians 12 list of gifts, are in operation. They can be things that people can move in, that we're called to eagerly pursue them, as it says in 1 Corinthians 14, and that they should be practiced in a way that's healthy, but that is encouraged within a church context. So it says not to despise prophecy, but to test it. So that means, right, well, this is something that we're thinking about, and we're sensing if the Lord's saying something. And all of the, you can get into the weeds in terms of what exactly, what level we put prophecy on. Prophecy would very much be under Scripture. I would call it more, so it's not fresh revelation. I would call it the leading of the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit leading you specifically to share something with some people. I think that's a term that I think most Christians could actually agree on, even if they wouldn't necessarily use the term prophecy. But that's really where we would roughly place it. And do you know what? We've been really blessed. We've seen a number of people experience healing recently, which has been wonderful in our church context. It's something we pray for. We don't push it. We say, yep, we should be believing for it. We don't push it to the point that if someone is not healed, that their lack of belief is the cause thereof. That is, I would say, very abusive. Spoke about that publicly a few weeks ago when preaching on faith, actually. So we wouldn't do that. But should we be believing for these things? I think the Bible does encourage us to do so, and so we're not just open to it, we're pursuing it, but pursuing it in a way that is biblically ordered as best we know how. And very much also, we would say that we want to have that balance of the Spirit and the Word, and that everybody's trying to do that. Who isn't trying to do that? But we would put a lot of emphasis on preaching in our church context. Both me and my pastor, the senior pastor, we carry the bulk of the preaching. So we'll probably do about 3 out of 5 between the two of us. More like 4 out of 5 rather. So and we preach 40 minutes plus, and it's hopefully expositional. Get into the Bible, see what the text means, apply it to the hearer. We try and do so well. We try and do so in a style that's engaging and so on. But we're not light in that regard, and don't want to be. We want to have plenty of that as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that ties into the megachurch kind of evangeli culture that is so normative across the West in many areas, or at least urban areas. I'll say in the Global Methodist Church, which is the crew I'm a part of that's starting off, there is a huge emphasis on a worship style that very much resembles some of these largest charismatic megachurches. High emotionalism, the lights and the volume and the I should be able to talk about it more intelligently, but there's a whole aesthetic that comes with this that I know you're familiar with. And I watched your piece on your most recent piece, Why I Left Megachurch, and you didn't give a full answer, but one of the things that I was able to sink my teeth into was it prioritizes growth over faithfulness. That's how I would sum it up. And that's something that I think denotes Western Christianity as a whole. I think we got very into growth, the excitement of growth and power a long time ago, and that there hasn't really been much serious consideration, at least among Methodists, of taking a countercultural stand that divides people. So there are people like John MacArthur, I'm sure you know that name, who says, yes, doctrine divides. It divides truth from fiction and right. Error from righteousness. And so there are not many people like that in Methodism, and that's been one of my long-term concerns for the Global Methodist Church is if we cannot see that growth and faithfulness are sometimes opposed, not always opposed, but sometimes opposed, and if we can't every single one of those times choose faithfulness over growth, then I'm very concerned about the long-term quality of any movement such as that. So what are your thoughts in how I've summarized your thoughts, but also how I've spoken to my context? What wisdom do you think there is to be offered there?
Yeah, that is my main concern. So in my video, I talked about a few of the contexts that I've been in. I've seen lots of. I want to be careful because I when talking about it, the people that I've seen in those contexts, I believe, are faithful Christians broadly. They're sincere, and there are a lot of faithful Christians then within that as well who are attending these churches. And I'm not a sort of write everybody off person at all. But I did, and I'm actually very thankful. That's where I got saved, started in ministry, all of this stuff that, I'm very, very genuinely and sincerely thankful to lots of people for. But yes, I think we do this, I think it's very prevalent in a megachurch context. I would also say a mainline context is another area, and I would be looking at the Church of England as a prime example, but it may well play out in the sort of Methodist Church in America of, in order to grow, we must be like the world. We can't offend the world. And yes, any sign of a dip, any sign of people leaving means we've done something wrong, which just biblically it doesn't. As I said in my video on the topic, Jesus managed to take a crowd of thousands and shrink it down to 12 people in one sermon, which is the exact opposite of church growth. It would have been considered a disaster by most people, other than Jesus, who I think was probably quite a big fan and was very happy to have been able to see who's really with me here. And I do think it's a tendency. I was chatting, again, this is something I said in the video, but for the sake of the audience that maybe haven't seen it, I was speaking to the pastor of what was at the time and was for a couple of years the fastest growing church in America, because I worked for a church planting network that was with all of these guys. So I met a whole bunch of people in conferences and green rooms and things like that. And they said, we got talking about sexuality and the challenges thereof. And they said, yep, we will never mention this publicly because if we do, we can give up on church growth. Firstly, I think they're wrong. I don't think you can give up on church growth. I actually think that God will grow his church through that often. I could give a story. I'll tell you a story. We had an agnostic guy come to our church last week and put his daughter in the kids' work, came along, loved the service, came to our newcomers lunch, which was just starting that day. Like he was like, first time here, oh, there's a lunch after, great, I'll go meet some people. Loved it. And was complaining to me as an agnostic that churches don't speak up enough on issues. He's like, I'm really frustrated that churches, are so quiet and silent. So there's actually, I think, a real, you might call it an untapped market. That's such a horrible term, but you probably, you know what I mean? There's people out there who are looking for truth.
An unstretched itch.
Yeah, they're looking for truth, and they know the church is supposed to speak on these issues, and they would actually show up if they did. And I think that's part of the reason we've attracted some people like that. We're not shy. Again, we're not every Sunday hammering, like it's not turn or burn every single Sunday, but we're just comfortable addressing the issues. Like we just don't mind doing it. Mm-hmm. So obviously, yeah. So I think you can go through it, but I also think that makes an idol out of growth. And it really turns your church into a marketing company more than anything else. Like that's how do we market this? And the fundamental underlying product doesn't matter. We can cover that all up, pretend that that's not there in order to get people through the door. And I think that is an error. I think it's an error. You can make it in the megachurch context, you make it in the mainline context. It's not, but I think it's certainly one that I saw a lot of in that movement, where we will not talk about issues that are tearing the church apart, leading people into sin, leading people away from their faith, causing people to deconstruct because it's unpopular. I just can't. For me, I mean, the Northern Irish are probably slightly outspoken. I think we're friendly, but we'll also speak our minds. So for me to not do that, I find is very unnatural. Actually, I don't mind if people like me or not. It doesn't really bother me, particularly on the internet. What are they going to do? Tweet at me? Yeah, so, right, okay. I think we should get a little bit more of a spine. I think it has been lacking, unfortunately, in the church for quite some time. And we can get into all the reasons as to why that is, but it's a problem, yeah.
Well, I had hoped that we would be able to cover more ground. I'm always too ambitious in what I want to do in just a 1-hour segment. And I'm sure if we were hanging out, having coffee, we could, in person, enjoy going quite at length. But we're nearing the end now. And as I'm thinking on these topics that I know you and I both care very much about, some of the calculus that is involved here in making these decisions and the kind of church cultures that we form is stuff around the bare minimum of what it takes to be saved. I think a lot of these large corporate churches are of the mind that if you just say Jesus' name every now and again, that's enough to save these people that are in your pews. But then it's also a question of how much should the church culture represent the culture people are coming out of versus the culture that they're going into. And so I've read a lot of stuff about the early church that makes me hunger and yearn for. The main book that's really just ruined me has been called the Patient Ferment of the Early Church, where this historian Alan Creeder shows just how countercultural the early church was and how much the Roman context needed that, such that they grew from a fringe cult to 10% of the Roman population in just 100 years. And that was by being an explicitly exclusive organization that was somewhat hostile to new people. They were able to stand with integrity against a depraved culture, and they were rewarded by transforming that culture. And then, of course, they were transformed by that culture, and that's the rest of history. But as we're looking at these dynamics of the bare minimum that it takes to be saved and how otherworldly the church should look, are there some kind of closing thoughts that you think would be helpful to offer those who've spent this time with us?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of directions you could take it. I do think when you look at, so take the Methodist movement as a profoundly good example of this, where you had a church that was accommodating of the spirit of the age. It was all, the Church of England at the time was bowing to, the philosophies of the day. It was sort of theistic, vaguely philosophical ideas. The culture was falling apart. People tend to think that Britain had this wonderful sort of Christian culture throughout the early 1700s, late 1600s, early 1700s in Britain was not a good period. There was, massive issues of how they treated the poor. There was issues of prostitution, and it was a culture that was falling apart and probably would have gone the way of. Sorry, I said early 1700s. Yeah, making sure I got my centuries right here. They would have gone the way of the French with the French Revolution easily. There was that kind of place, and Wesley and Whitefield, and all of their then hundreds and thousands of wonderful godly preachers whose names maybe are not as well known. They came out with a message that was intentionally countercultural and counter the spirit of the age as it was affecting the church, and it led to an enormous revival. It led to an outpouring of the Spirit of God. It was not a popular message. Their meetings were regularly involved attempts to break them up by mobs, people driving cattle through the meetings. This was not going out there and appeasing the masses. This was go out there, preach the gospel, confront the sins and the ideas of the age, and call people to turn from them, and of course offer them the wonderful gift of the grace of God, new life, new birth, all of those wonderful things that we get to have as believers and which are on offer to the world as well. So I just, if you look at the church when it's been least effective, it's been when it's looked most like the world. So even though I think you can temporarily get a spike potentially in church growth, you broadly speaking will fail long term. Unless you reverse out of that. You have to talk about these issues, and particularly if you leave it a generation or so, the children that are raised in that church, are they going to be believers, or are they going to be swayed by the worldviews, the lofty arguments that set themselves up against the knowledge of Christ? These are things that you have to address as the church, or you're not just sacrificing faithfulness. I think you're sacrificing long-term fruitfulness as well. I think you're sacrificing growth. And again, we shouldn't all be about growth, but growth is a good thing. I think the church growing is a blessing. If we want to see it grow, not just in a way where we can get people to show up because we're the sexiest thing, sorry to use that term, but we're the hot thing that's out there for the last decade, and we've got the best music and lights or whatever. And I don't actually mind music and lights. Like I stylistically, I'm kind of I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong in that regard. I think it depends on context, conscience, various other things. But you don't want to build your church on that and have 10 years where you're cool, and then, after that, no one's walking with the Lord anymore. That's a problem, right? So I think it's a more long-term strategy for actual growth of believers is to preach the whole gospel and the whole counsel of God.
That's that's where the real conversation is. And different people disagree about how it is that you form long-term disciples. Although I'm not sure it really is such a mystery. So anyway, we've done our part just participating a little bit in that larger conversation that's going on. We've reached the end now, and I want to thank you for being so gracious with you were so easy to put this together with, and thank you. For those who spent time with me and you in this conversation, and they want to keep hearing you talking and perhaps follow your ministry and what you do, obviously you have a presence on YouTube. You just search Jamie Bambrick there, and his page will come up. Where else would you direct people to?
Yeah, Twitter's my other, or X is my other platform. So YouTube and Twitter is where I post. And other than that, you can literally follow me if you come to Belfast and stay at enough distance that I don't notice you, but probably more likely online. So yeah, YouTube and Twitter.
Okay, well, I'll put your handles to both of those in the show notes.
Thank you.
So, friends, I just want to thank you for spending time with me and Jamie. I would urge you, whenever this ends, just to pray for him and his ministry, and that he would be effective, and that the Lord would continue to guide him and his pastor and leading their flock. And then I would just also ask that you spend time meditating on these things, especially if you're in the Global Methodist Church. I think as we form this culture, we need to keep these questions in mind and come to a good place that we can all. I personally think it would be a failure if we got to a place in 10 years where you could be a Global Methodist and believe anything like the United Methodists or like the Anglican. And my prayer for the Anglicans and the Methodists is that they can coalesce around a common set of ideas that they all conform to and find common joy and identity. And so may your tribe be so blessed, Jamie. Of course, the Methodists came out of the Anglicans, and as we're talking about reclaiming good things from the past, I still every now and again say a prayer for the reunion of the Methodists and the Anglicans. And the future is a crazy place. Who knows what's going to happen? But if the Anglican Church is full of gentlemen like you, then I'd be happy to be a part of it. So thanks again, you for joining me, Jamie, and thanks again, everybody else, for this conversation. God bless you. I'll see you next time.
Thank you.